Our entire discussion these last few lectures has been predicated on the standard philosophical definition of knowledge, justified true belief. But some philosophers have argued that this definition of knowledge falls short. In fact, there's widespread agreement on this. Justified true belief may be necessary for knowledge, but not sufficient. But before we get to that, a couple of quick notes are in order. First, we're going to be getting pretty heavy into some pretty deep stuff here, and you may have to listen to this lecture more than once. And nothing here is essential for anything that we will do next, so if you don't get it, don't fret. But it is one of the big questions, and it deals with one of the most groundbreaking arguments in all of philosophy, so we do need to cover it. Second, we're going to be considering a number of thought experiments. It might get a little frustrating as some of them are, well, they're kind of ridiculous. But the point of thought experiments is not to describe something that actually did or is likely to happen. They're only meant to reveal our intuitions, in this case, our intuitions about what's required for knowledge. We'll consider a number of different situations where a person is aware or unaware of certain evidence and consider whether they would have knowledge. Many of these situations are implausible, but again, that's not the point. To see why, consider this. You're trying to decide which movie trilogy you like best. Let's say the original Star Wars trilogy or The Lord of the Rings. So, I ask, if you had to choose one to never see again, which one would you choose? Now, if your response is, well, I guess I'd give up Star Wars, but what does that matter? I mean, that's never going to happen. I own both. I don't have to give up either one of them. Well, then you missed the point. I know you don't have to give up either, but knowing which one you would give up tells us something about your preferences, your beliefs, your intuitions. Likewise, the thought experiments we're about to consider are unlikely, but that doesn't mean they can't tell us something about the nature of knowledge. So don't let the ridiculousness of some of these experiments stand in the way of you understanding the philosophical points we're about to discuss. Okay, so back to the claim that justified true belief is necessary but not sufficient for knowledge. This is most famously argued for by Edmund Gettier in a 3-page paper entitled, "Is Justified True Belief Knowledge?" It's an extremely short paper, but it revolutionized epistemology, the study of knowledge. Gettier argues that the traditional justified true belief definition of knowledge is insufficient by providing counterexamples in which individuals have justified true belief, but clearly lack knowledge. There are a number of ways to articulate such examples. Gettier's original example is a bit hard to follow, so let me just give you my own. Well, actually, I say it's my own. My memory tells me that I developed it as an undergraduate, but apparently it's based on one expressed by the modern epistemologist Jonathan Dancy, and it also appears on the Gettier Wikipedia page. I guess that shows us just how reliable our memories are. Anyway, imagine that you're walking through the lobby of a dorm room and you're wondering who the winner of the US Open Finals match was that day. Along the way, you see Venus and Serena Williams playing each other on the television with the words US Open Final in the bottom right-hand corner. You just started following tennis this year, but you know that Venus and Serena were scheduled to play in the finals today. So you sit down to watch the rest of the match, and Venus defeats Serena. So you justifiably conclude that Venus won this year's US Open. Now, of course, you're right. She did win. So you have a justified true belief. But as it turns out, things are not quite as you assumed. Unbeknownst to you, last year, Venus and Serena also played in the US Open final as well. And last year, Venus beat Serena. And what you were watching was a replay of last year's final, one that looked almost identical to this year's final and had the same outcome. For argument's sake, we can even say that some television technician played it instead of this year's final as a practical joke. Now, again, your belief is true. Venus really did win this year's US Open, and your belief is justified. Certainly, watching a sporting event on television is a reliable means to gain true belief about the outcome of a sporting event. But you have a justified true belief. But clearly, it seems you do not have knowledge. Given that you were watching a replay of last year's final, you do not have knowledge of the outcome of this year's final, even though you have a justified true belief about its outcome. So it seems that the traditional definition of knowledge, justified true belief, is somehow inadequate. Something else seems to be missing. Something else, it seems, is required for knowledge. Well, ever since Gettier's paper was published in 1963, epistemology has been concerned with trying to solve the problem he raised. The history of epistemological research in the last half of the 20th century is dominated by this issue. So there's no way that I can do justice to it here in just one lecture. But I think we can get a general sense of what knowledge is, and perhaps what it isn't, by looking at some other philosophers' responses to Gettier's problem. Many such responses suggest something is lacking in Gettier cases that is needed for knowledge. For example, perhaps there is not strong enough justification. Knowledge is justified true belief, the argument goes, but the justification that is required for knowledge is far stronger than the justification present in Gettier cases. After all, watching television is not an infallible method for gaining true beliefs. Even sports reporters get the outcomes of sporting events wrong occasionally. In order for justified true belief to be knowledge, the justification can't have led you astray. In other words, according to this argument, knowledge is true belief with certain justification. The problem with this suggestion is probably obvious. If justification that is strong is required, that strong is required for knowledge, then we don't know anything, beyond perhaps, as Descartes might suggest, the existence of our own mind. If a definition of knowledge is going to have any value, it has to track with our intuition, what seems obviously true and what everyone in general agrees with. And most people agree that we know a great number of things. Of course, you can choose to reject this intuition in favor of this definition of knowledge if you're willing, but most philosophers are not. Another suggestion is this. The reason knowledge is missing from Gettier cases is that the justification on which they are based includes some kind of false belief. In the earlier example, your belief that you were watching this year's US Open is false, but that belief was used to justify your belief about the outcome, your true belief that Venus won this year's US Open. And so the suggestion goes, knowledge is true belief with justification that's not based on false evidence. Now, this suggestion seems promising, but it falls apart once you realize that in some Gettier cases, no false beliefs are involved in justifying a true belief, and yet knowledge is still not present. Here's a great example from my dissertation advisor, Linda Zagzebski. She's the Kingfisher College Chair of Philosophy of Religion and Ethics at the University of Oklahoma and the author of On Epistemology. Her example goes like this. An intelligent doctor notices that a patient has all the classic symptoms of virus V1, and so justifiably concludes that the patient has V1. She's made similar diagnoses before and has always been right. Now, it turns out that the symptoms are actually due to the patient having virus V2, a currently unknown virus that presents just like V1. But it just so happens the patient was just exposed and contracted V1 just before entering the doctor's office. So not soon enough for virus V1 to be responsible for the symptoms, but soon enough to make it true that the patient has virus V1 at the time of diagnosis. Clearly, the doctor's conclusion that the patient has V1 is a justified true belief based on no false beliefs at all. And yet, it doesn't count as knowledge. So, it seems that the no false evidence suggestion is off the mark as well. Besides, our knowledge, all of our knowledge, is based on false evidence in one way or another. Everybody has false beliefs, yet all your beliefs are related to each other in some way or another. Recall Quine's web of belief, which suggests that our beliefs are laid out in such a way that they are epistemically supported by one another. Ultimately, my belief that I have two hands is justified, at least in some roundabout way, by some false thing that I believe. But still, I know I have two hands. In fact, it seems that a false belief could even play a central role in justifying a belief, and it could still count as knowledge. For example, astronomers before Einstein had false beliefs about gravity. Those beliefs were based on Newtonian notions of physics, which Einstein later proved false. Yet the predictions they made based on those beliefs about planetary motion were usually spot on, and we would count them as knowledge. They knew where each planet would be in each night sky. So again, it seems that the knowledge can't be based on false belief definition is mistaken. So let's consider yet another suggestion. So far, the people involved in the Gettier cases we've been considering are missing a vital piece of information or evidence, something that, if they knew it to be true, would cause them to relinquish their belief. For example, if you knew that someone was playing a practical joke by playing last year's US Open, you would not form a belief about who won this year's US Open. Or if the doctor knew about the existence of virus V2, she would likely refrain from concluding that the patient had virus V1. In both cases, there's a piece of evidence that would undo, that would defeat the justification that one initially had for belief. So maybe we could understand knowledge this way. One knows something when one has a justified true belief, and there is nothing that one can learn that would defeat the justification that one has. Okay, again, sounds promising, but we can see why it's problematic with yet another thought experiment. This one comes from a 1969 paper called Knowledge, Undefeated Justified True Belief by Keith Blair and Thomas Paxton Jr. Suppose you're in the library, quietly reading a book, and you look up to see one of your colleagues, Tom Grabbit, grab a book off the shelf. You then see him stuff it in his sweater as he walks out of the library. You justifiably form the belief that Tom Grabbit stole a library book. But suppose, unbeknownst to you, that Tom's mother has publicly announced that Tom is actually overseas in Europe and that his twin brother, John Grabbit, a kleptomaniac, visited the library today. Clearly, the fact that she said this is a piece of evidence that, if you learned it, would destroy the justification that you have for believing that Tom stole a book. The fact that she said that is something you could learn that would defeat your justification. Now, let's still suppose that you have no idea that she said that. But let's also suppose that she completely made it up. She's a pathological liar, and Tom's twin brother, John, doesn't even exist. He's just a figment of her imagination. No one knows that's true but her, but it is true. So it really was Tom that you saw stealing the book. Now, in this situation, it seems that you do know that Tom stole the book. Yet, it's still the case that there is something you could learn that would defeat your justification. The fact that Tom's mother said what she said is what you could learn that would defeat your justification. So it seems it is possible to have knowledge even when there are learnable facts that would undo your justification. So it seems the notion that knowledge requires undefeatable justification is incorrect. Another reply to Gettier has to do with causation. Notice, for example, in the US Open thought experiment that you're causally removed from the thing that you're forming a belief about. You're forming a belief about this year's US Open, but your belief is caused by viewing last year's US Open. The doctor was forming a belief about virus V1, but the symptoms were actually caused by V2. So perhaps we can suggest that knowledge is justified true belief where the belief in question is caused or brought about by the subject of the belief. But once again, there are problems. First, some beliefs are not caused by a subject of belief at all. For example, the axioms of logic, like nothing is both true and false, well, they're not really caused by anything. They're just simply true. And yet, we still know that they're true. Other beliefs are true by definition, like all bachelors are unmarried. But a definition is not the subject of that belief. All bachelors are the subject of that belief. Besides, what would it mean for a definition to cause a belief? Only physical events or objects can really have causal efficacy. Definitions cannot. But we can also demonstrate this definition's shortcomings with a counterexample, one with a long history. It's been discussed by a long string of philosophers such as Saul Kripke and Alvin Goldman and Carl Gennett. It's called the Barn County example. So, suppose Bob is driving through Barn County and notices a red barn off to the side of the road. He forms the belief about the existence of a barn in that particular location. Something like, there is a barn in location X. Now, as it happens, that's true. There is a barn in that location. And clearly, Bob is justified in believing so, since seeing things in broad daylight usually provides adequate justification for believing that they are there. His belief that there is a barn is even caused by that very barn. But, unbeknownst to Bob, the reason that Barn County is called Barn County is because its residents have erected a number of barn facades, structures that look like barns but are not, kind of like a Hollywood set. They look indistinguishable from real barns from the road, but upon inspection, it would be obvious that they're fake. Barn County is filled with these things. In fact, the red barn that Bob saw is the only actual barn in Barn County. Given this fact, it seems quite clear that seeing something that looks like a barn while in Barn County is not enough to give one knowledge that a barn actually exists in that location. And so, despite the fact that Bob has a justified true belief that is caused by the object of his belief, the barn in location X, he still does not have knowledge. He just got lucky that his barn-like experience happened because he saw the one and only barn in Barn County. So the causal theory of knowledge is right out. All right, geez, this is getting a little discouraging. Every redefinition we try fails. Well, Linda Zagzebski has argued that all such attempts are doomed to fail. In her paper, The Inescapability of Gettier Problems, she argues it's not possible to avoid Gettier cases by simply taking the traditional justified true belief definition of knowledge and tweaking it by altering what justification means or adding some criterion to it. We might call this the true belief plus X method. In fact, any account of knowledge that suggests knowledge is true belief plus something else, whether it be a certain kind of justification or whatever, is going to be subject to Gettier counterexamples. The reason why, Zagzebski says, this is true, is that no matter what you add to true belief, you can always produce a counterexample, a Gettier counterexample, where that condition for knowledge is met, and yet one still does not have knowledge. To do so, you only have to imagine a situation in which someone has a belief that fits the criteria, that's justified by whatever means, but that is actually false. And then you just slightly tweak the example so that the belief turns out to be true by chance. Every time you'll get something that is a true belief that also fits your criteria, but that is not knowledge. Zagzebski actually uses this method to discredit Alvin Plantinga's attempted solution to the Gettier problem. Plantinga suggests that knowledge is true belief plus warrant, where warrant involves one's faculties working properly in an appropriate environment. But, Zagzebski suggests, we can imagine a situation in which somebody justifiably formed a false belief where their appropriately working faculties are in the appropriate conditions. Suppose, for example, Mary comes home and upon seeing someone who looks like her husband in the living room, forms the belief that her husband is in the living room, when in fact, she sees her husband's brother. Let's say she sees only the back of his head and the backs of their heads look very much alike. So, she has a justified belief and her faculties are properly functioning in the appropriate condition. Now, this doesn't count as knowledge, her belief is false. But she has everything else she needs. Belief plus whatever is supposedly required for knowledge, in this case, warrant, properly working faculties in an appropriate environment. So now, we just have to tweak the example to make the belief true by sheer luck. Let's say her husband's actually standing off to the side in the living room where she can't see him. Well, now she has a warranted true belief. Yet, Mary still lacks knowledge. And we could repeat this process ad infinitum for any true belief plus X definition of knowledge. Although this seems to make things hopeless, it may actually help us resolve Gettier's problem. It seems that what's involved in each Gettier counterexample is some kind of epistemic luck. Your belief is justified, but what justifies the belief isn't what makes it true. It only happens to be true by happenstance. It just so happened that Venus also won this year's US Open. It just so happened that the patient also had virus V1. It just so happened that Bob was looking at the only real barn in Barn County. It just so happens that Mary's husband was actually in the living room out of sight. So maybe what makes something knowledge is the fact that it's not lucky. Maybe knowledge is unlucky justified true belief. Justified true belief that one does not get by luck. Such a definition would avoid Gettier counterexamples generated by Zagzebski's method. However, in the lesson of Gettier, Zagzebski argues such a definition still falls short because it only tells us what knowledge is not. It doesn't tell us what knowledge is. And if our understanding of knowledge is going to be useful, if among other things it's going to help us gain knowledge, it must tell us what knowledge is. But not all is lost. Maybe the reason we failed to capture what knowledge is because we've been going about it all wrong. Zagzebski argues that the importance of Gettier's argument goes beyond exposing the inadequacies of the traditional definition of knowledge. Our response to the Gettier problem itself, the continual attempts at analyzing knowledge in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions and then showing them to be inadequate by producing counterexamples, suggests that our analytic approach of evaluating knowledge was flawed to begin with. Instead, she says, of defining knowledge as true belief plus X, we should be looking to, she says, close the gap between true belief and X so that they're not distinct components, so that what makes a belief knowledge is tied up with what makes that belief true. To this end, Zagzebski suggests a credit theory of knowledge that explicates the relationship between how a belief is acquired and why that belief is true. As she puts it, knowledge is belief that gets to the truth rather than falsehood because of the intellectually virtuous motives and behavior of the believer. Now, strictly speaking, any belief that is true because it accurately describes the world. So says the correspondence theory of truth. But what Zagzebski is suggesting is that you possess knowledge when the explanation for how you possess a belief that is true is rooted in your own virtuous epistemic practices. Adopting this understanding of knowledge not only avoids the Gettier problem. Virtuous epistemic practices don't explain why a belief is true if it's only true by luck. But it also helps us to understand why knowledge is valuable in the first place. It helps us understand how we attain knowledge with virtuous epistemic practices. It helps us explain why those who have knowledge get credit or are praiseworthy, because they are epistemically virtuous. They have carefully formed their beliefs. And these are all a part of the project of virtue epistemology, which aimed at explicating the value of knowledge and the virtues involved in attaining it. The intellectual virtues and virtuous epistemic practices are something we've already discussed in the first lectures. One is more likely to attain true belief when she proportions her belief to the evidence, is intellectually courageous and humble, avoids logically fallacious thinking, favors the most adequate explanation, etc. And although virtue epistemology helps us understand what knowledge is, the virtue epistemologist is less concerned with defining knowledge and more concerned with discovering and promoting the practices by which one attains it. In his book, A Virtue Epistemology, Ernest Sosa compares one's skills in forming beliefs with the skill of an archer. An archer's shot is accurate merely if it hits the target. But we might also ask if the shot was accurate due to the archer's skill or some other random occurrence. For example, if the archer's shot was going to miss, but a gust of wind pushed it back into the bullseye, well, that shot was accurate, but not because of the archer's skill. It was just luck. If, however, the shot was accurate because of the archer's skill, Sosa would call that shot apt. Well, we can think of knowledge in a similar way. A belief is accurate if it's true. That's all it takes. And belief can be produced skillfully or unskillfully. But a belief is apt, Sosa says, if it is true and was produced in a skillful way, if the agent successfully attained true belief because of their epistemic skill. And that is what knowledge is, according to Sosa, apt belief. Now, I'm not 100% sure that this solution fully escapes the Gettier problem. Think of the Barn County case again. It does seem that Bob's belief that there is a barn is apt. It's true and just as skillfully acquired as similar beliefs about barns seen outside of Barn County. There is nothing, it seems, unvirtuous about trusting one's senses about ordinary affairs in broad daylight. And yet it still seems that it's not a case of knowledge. In reply, however, the virtue epistemologist might suggest that Bob's belief was not true because it was skillfully acquired, given that he was in Barn County. It was luck that enabled him to attain a belief that was true. Or one might suggest the Barn County case is an example of knowledge, and so it's not a counterexample. This seems to be Sosa's take. He suggests, despite the fact that Bob is in a county filled with fake barns, he still knows that there is a barn before him. Bob lacks only reflective knowledge, not knowledge itself. Regardless, I think the virtue epistemologists are onto something here. In fact, I think the archer analogy can give us an even deeper understanding of what knowledge is. Where the analogy between archery and knowledge seems to break down is when you realize that an archer's shot can be more or less accurate. A shot that hits the target but is not on the bullseye is more accurate than one that misses the target altogether. But the truth of a belief does not admit of different degrees. Either a belief is true or it's not. It either hits the bullseye or it misses the target completely. And so it seems with knowledge. But maybe, actually, knowledge is more like an archer's shot, something that comes in degrees. Perhaps we should stop thinking about knowledge as something so precise, as if it is something that you either have or you don't. Maybe knowledge does come in different degrees. After all, even though truth does not come in degrees, justification does. You can have more or less evidence for something. So why not suggest that this confers different degrees of knowledge? This reminds me of a great discussion from the TV show, The Big Bang Theory. Sheldon and Stewart are in an argument about who should take up the bat cowl if Batman's death were permanent. Stewart says that Sheldon's answer couldn't be more wrong. Sheldon replies, "More wrong? Wrong is an absolute state and not subject to gradation." But Stewart, I think rightly, points out, of course it is. It's a little wrong to say that a tomato is a vegetable. It's very wrong to say it's a suspension bridge. Newton's theories may be wrong, but they were not as wrong as the theories that came before him. The doctor in Zagzebski's example may have been wrong in thinking that virus V1 was causing the symptoms, but she is not as wrong as someone who thinks they are caused by demons. Knowledge may really come in degrees. Similarly, maybe knowledge comes in different types. Maybe there is certain knowledge, like my knowledge that 1 + 1 = 2, and grounded knowledge, like my knowledge of scientific truth. Then maybe there's moral knowledge, knowledge of right and wrong itself. Maybe it comes in varying degrees as well. And maybe there is lucky knowledge. Indeed, maybe there is knowledge in Gettier cases. You do know who won the US Open. You're just lucky to know. Indeed, studies have been done on whether or not the average person, the non-philosopher, thinks there is knowledge in Gettier cases, and a surprising number of people do. Maybe this is because the average person doesn't consider knowledge to be an all or nothing affair. But even though we don't have a single agreeable definition of knowledge, I think we now have a pretty good understanding of what knowledge is. And more importantly, we understand it as something that may come in degrees, and understand the importance of being an apt believer, someone who forms their beliefs skillfully and proportions their beliefs to the evidence. With that in mind, we should consider whether or not certain kinds of evidence are good, whether or not a skillful believer would take particular pieces of evidence or kinds of evidence seriously. For example, when, if ever, can someone else's testimony justify your belief in a way that confers knowledge? Answering this question will also be relevant to answering the question of the next section: can religious belief be justified?